currently, the open source intelligence, meaning what you would read in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, highlights that there are over 140 different organizations inside U.S. networks today, known connected to state sponsors. And overwhelmingly, the target is not the Department of Defense, it is not the Department of Homeland Security, but it is our private sector. 80% of all intellectual property resides beyond the defensive structure the Department of Defense provides for its networks and resides wholly in the private sector. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to be operating in the private sector today. We've all heard the stories of Target Corporation and Home Depot, and most recently with Sony. But let's put some numbers associated with that. As a result of an attack on Target for its commercial sales, they lost $252 million in net revenue. Now what does that do to the name brand? Did anybody here have a credit card? Have you ever shopped at Target? Have you ever been worried about what happens to that information? All that is your credit card information and your name. Ultimately, though, what that's doing is that even if you cancel it after a few minutes, the amount of money that they're able to do in selling just that information, not the actual exploitation, but the selling of that information, is going to finance criminal elements, terrorist elements, and certainly going to nation states. The one here that I think is probably most poignant that we've seen is that Sony Corporation lost the personal information of 25 million end users. So anyone have a Sony PlayStation in your house? Anyone ever watched a Sony movie online? Anyone ever been in a situation where you bought a ticket for a Sony movie? That information with your credit card information is all retained by Sony. That information was lost last year. As a result, Sony CEO is currently looking at potentially moving on to another line of work. And importantly, Sony looked at a $1.25 million cleanup fee. Imagine what their insurance company is looking at to help remedy that in the future. All right, very quickly we've seen the technology drivers being both in the, what we traditionally think of as our laptops, going to a network, and now moving into mobile. So everybody's cell phone that you have thankfully turned off is equally in a position where it could be a threat. So let's look a little bit at the threat very quickly. Cyber is now used as a force multiplier. In the relationship between Iran and the United States today, the traditional idea of it just being a nuclear standoff or a Cold War of ideas, or the capability for the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, to get outside of Iran and impact things in Syria or in Lebanon or in Yemen. Cyber now becomes a massive force multiplier, not only in the things that we would think of as YouTube videos for recruitment. The foreign fighter flow to Syria has more than whatever times a dozen is, has increased by 12, mainly because of the very effective use of Iranian propaganda to recruit young, generally men, who are disinfluenced within their country to come fight in Syria. Additionally, you can see that traditional physical attack will almost always have a cyber component. And so when you're looking at a threat like Ukraine, the first thing the Russians did when advancing their interests in Ukraine was not to launch a kinetic, in a military term, a military strike on Ukraine, but was to go after their critical infrastructure by taking down their electric grid and limiting their communications. Highly effective, that allowed an insurgency group in Odessa to take control in eastern Ukraine. Here in the United States, what does that mean? It's hard to see this, but cyber warfare now represents 45% of all threats to our critical infrastructure. So when we talk about our emergency response systems, when we talk about our ability to summon a military response through C2 nodes that reside on the network. I remember flying over Afghanistan, and we had an encrypted network that would go up to a satellite, it would come back down to the United States, and we would talk to US Stratcom. But during a portion of that, we used commercial servers. One, it was cheaper, but two, because so much of the DoD's network is dependent on that partnership with critical infrastructure on the commercial side. And so when Verizon went down for a patch at 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning in the United States, they thought, well, hey, we sent an email out to our customers, there's no one out there who would really need to have this much bandwidth, we're going to go ahead and take down parts of that network. For us, flying in Afghanistan, at what was at our time 6 in the evening, it was incredibly important to be able to make sure that that comm network was working. And we had to revert to another other satellite, far more expensive, but potentially if we had been in a troop in contact conflict, we would have lost connectivity with that Marine battalion. Something you never want to be in, something that we learn as the process goes on. What I'm trying to say is that as we continue to increase both our cyber dependency as well as our cyber connectivity, very rarely do we appreciate where all those connective tissues reside and who has the ability to influence them. All right, we're going to try a couple of things here. First, I just want to highlight the fact that the investment coming out of Congress is not happening in a vacuum. Of last year's budget, one of the only things that both the Republicans, the Democrats, and the White House all agreed on is that a plus-up in cyber was mandatory. You can see here that the United States is looking at a $1.54 billion increase over the next 5 years through DARPA. That increase will be even larger when it comes to Homeland Security. I'm just going to focus real quickly on the defense sector spending so that we can get a comparison. NATO, as one of our largest allies in Western Europe, is looking at a $58 million increase. The United Kingdom, 650 million pounds, roughly equivalent to $1 billion US. Israel, $13 million. I would guess to say that anyone that knows Israel is spending a lot more than $13 million on their cyber defense today. China remains interesting. The ranges that the Department of Defense have highlighted is anywhere between 120 to 180 billion dollars. That's billion with a B, 180 billion dollars compared to where we are. And finally, looking at Tehran. For a country the size of Iran, with the number of investments, with the number of restrictions, with the limitation even on its export of oil at this point, to be putting a price tag of $1 billion into the development of its cybersecurity program should highlight to everyone that this is a real priority for them. And so as we look at the ongoing negotiations between both the United States and Iran, when it looks at scaling back the sanctions, when we look at partnering with Iran to say there are great opportunities for friendship in the future, but we also look at what we believe, I think many policymakers in the United States, is the greatest threat coming from Iran today is the aspect that it will become a nuclear enfranchised country that could actually launch a nuclear attack. Yes, that is something we should all be concerned about. But by lifting sanctions, by looking just at the nuclear threat, are we at some point actually missing the cyber threat that's already been perpetrated for the last 3 years? Let's talk about that a little bit. So does anyone remember Stuxnet? I'm going to get into a little bit of a techie language. Stuxnet was a virus that went global. Let's see if I can get out of this. I'm going to ask for a slide assistant. I think we got this. Here we go. So let me just talk briefly on Stuxnet. Stuxnet was the first time I think most of the world became aware of the true impact of a malicious virus, or what we call software, malware. Unlike a lot of things where you might be opening your email and all of a sudden you realize that you just inherited $1 billion from a prince in Nigeria, you just need to click on this link and send your information off. That's spear phishing. They're trying to get on your computer, they're trying to take over your computer. Malware is the actual insertion of a malicious code into your system. Now it could come in terms of a virus, it might be a worm. But what Stuxnet did is it identified a number of servers that were being provided by Siemens manufacturer to an Iranian centrifuge facility in Ddos. The issue was that a SCADA system or a control system spins these centrifuges at a very high rate of speed, and as a result over time plutonium rods can be enriched into nuclear uranium. What a force was capable of doing, it's highly assessed that this is both a joint force that came from the United States and from Israel. I'll leave that up to your research to determine what you think it truly is. Was able to inject a thumb drive into this control system, and as a result, we've all heard, it spent those 80 centrifuges out of control, effectively physically crippling that facility. Now, a couple of important takeaways from that. There's no loss of life by either side. There was no direct military incursion into a sovereign nation, at least in the way that we traditionally think about it. And there was an ability to influence an actor with very little attribution as to who had done it. The end result was that the desired effect that Iran would stop enriching uranium had been achieved. This is a paradigm shift when it comes to international relations, and certainly when it comes to how nation states interact with each other. We're not sending in Ambassador Kerry to do a negotiation. We're not sending in F-16s from Israel to drop bombs. We're not even going in there and assassinating Iranian nuclear scientists, which has happened now 7 times. We're simply going in and being able to eliminate a potential threat. Now obviously, for a country like Iran, this represents a very clear and direct threat to what their interests are. Imagine if that had happened in the United States. Next slide. So very quickly after this, during my first tour of the White House in 2011, 12, and 13, we saw that a sustained series of DDoS attacks occurred against US banks. Now for anyone not familiar with a DDoS attack, this is a distributed denial of service attack. And what that means is that those spear phishing attempts we talked about earlier, those guys from Nigeria giving you money, that friendly email that you got from grandma, that very phone that you got with a new app that's now corrupted, all of these devices are being taken over. They're called zombies. You don't realize it, you would use it just as normal. However, they're beaconing out and going to something as superficial as the Bank of America's website. 1 or 2 doesn't make a difference. Billions and billions of those 5 billions that we talked about brings down financial sectors. And what I mean by that is that so many pings are being addressed to that website, the public-facing website actually gets brought down. So when you go to check your bank account that day, or when you go to your ATM, or when you go to a situation where you want to transfer funds for that home loan, you're no longer able to access your bank. The connectivity tissue has now been overwhelmed. Now we've been able to find ways to counter this. Here in the United States, our recommendation through the NSC was to build what we called mass server rooms that basically bled off that information. So when you had a DDoS attack against this bank, we'd be able to take that threat information away. However, the challenge is that we've now moved from an area where the Iranian sector is no longer looking at just what they can do to limit accessibility, but truly prevent. So there you can see Dick Clark is the former cyber czar at the White House, and his focus has been on the fact that, you know, when we think of not being able to get to a website, we think of that as being inconvenient. When we think of actually the tactics, techniques, and procedures that an adversary could use to bring a bank during a closing bell on a second Tuesday in a month when everyone's books are due, and preventing them from being able to close out, now we're talking that cascade theory that I talked about earlier. Multiple banks being unable to close at the end of a financial quarter could truly cause a catastrophic economic downturn, not just in the United States, but much larger. Luckily, we haven't had an adversary that has been that attuned to how the financial sector works. I think that has very much changed. The second aspect that we want to look at is now that Iran has identified that they have a role to play here, and their soft power is very non-attributable, a group called the Iranian Cyber Army can't be tied directly to Tehran, but it certainly is executing action items of interest to Tehran. Can we go to the next slide? And so here's just a couple of events that we've seen in the last 3 years. Cyber disruptions aimed at U.S. government and the nuclear non-proliferation attacks. These have been going on ever since, both attacking the U.S. State Department's website, trying to undermine, and particularly presenting information to foreign parties that the United States is not a fair player in this. In 2012, we saw what was called a virus named Shamu, and this is a quick vignette of something that also happened to Razgas, both giant oil companies in the Middle East. Saudi Aramco, probably one of the largest competitors with Iran when it comes to the refinement of oil in the Persian Gulf region, found that it had been infected much in the same way that Stuxnet infected with the Shamu virus. But what Shamu did is it went into their entire computer system and destroyed the hard drives of 30,000 computers. Now, they didn't attack the SCADA system. They couldn't get into the actual oil production facility. But what they did do is they went after their bookkeeping office. And by destroying their bookkeeping office, Saudi Aramco didn't know how much money was out, how much money was in, and what its bills currently were. As a result, they effectively shut down Saudi Aramco for 3 months for operating. Pretty impactful stuff when you think about it. Cyber attacks against Israel communication during the conflict with Hamas over the summer of 2014. There are both sides to this story. I wouldn't say that it's just an Iranian actor here. Hacking for the Marine Corps' intranet. This is their internal network service that the Marine Corps uses all around the world, and fighting in both Afghanistan and Iran, that is independent of what we think of as the internet. This is just for their network. Iranian forces were able to both penetrate and also manipulate data on that network. Large-scale DDoS that we just talked about against U.S. banks, and most recently what we had last year here was a main supporter of Israel, a gentleman who owns a casino in Las Vegas, also a contributor to a number of presidential campaigns that were unfriendly to the Iranian regime, found that his network had not only been penetrated, but that all of his hard drives had been wiped. Think about what that means for a casino. Think about had that been an electric sector that we had gone after. Next slide. When it comes to Iran, I think we can't overestimate or underappreciate the level of propaganda that comes out of both sides. Both here in the United States, from our 24-hour news sources, when it comes to cyber, it sounds like everything's about to fall apart. But realistically, what Iran's ambitions are in the United States can't be achieved through traditional military, economic, or diplomatic means. Where they are able to level the playing field is when it comes to cyber. And so what Director Clapper highlights here very specifically, I want to read it for anybody in the back, in regards to cyber attacks, is one of the many tools conducting asymmetric, meaning non-traditional, what we just talked about, proportional retaliation against its enemies. The Iranians were behind not only the cyber attacks against the U.S. banks, but also that casino in Sands. Truly there is intent here, and truly we've been able to identify the level of connection with the Iranian government. That comes from the highest intelligence officer in the United States today. So if anyone ever says, well, you can't attribute it to actual happening out of Tehran, I would very much beg to differ. So let's talk very briefly about what we can do. Slide. As opposed to just hyping up the scare between two nations, the United States wants to be in a relationship with Iran, and I truly believe that the majority of Persians want to be in a relationship with the West that is both productive and mutually beneficial. So where the United States could do more than just foster cyber espionage is to actually be a pioneer in international policy as to what we should be doing as a country in the hopes that other countries will follow suit. In 2012, we published the International Strategy in Cybersecurity, laying out what the United States intended to do, and also putting some very open parameters on how we hope to engage with the rest of the world. But specifically in here, we focused on the strength of international partnerships. As I've said many times, it doesn't matter how secure your section of your boat is. If you have a leak in another section, the entire ship sinks. The same is true for cybersecurity. We are so interdependent with our partners and allies, with our cyber operations officer, but also with our criminal side, that if we have breaches in certain areas, whether it be from cybercrime, terrorism, or a nation state, the entire boat will sink. Next slide. So what can we do? The cost of security. For a number of large box stores, a $252 million loss for Target was cheaper than setting up a security plan. For Sony Corporation, the loss of $1.25 billion has now reached a threshold of pain where they can no longer allow themselves to consistently be breached. The same is true for both the United States and for Iran. The investment that we saw on the earlier slides indicates that both countries are actively looking to defend their cyber network. The question now becomes, is cyber defense or cyber offense a better way to protect your network? I think as a policymaker, it behooves us to be able to say that cyber defense goes far beyond, because we can protect the entire DoD global intelligence framework. We can protect most US entities, but what we cannot protect is that 80% of private sector that's outside our realm of defense. Going forward, I would, next slide. I want to be able to engage in a conversation that really talks about where we are as a country in our policy development, where we could better partner and make it clear to the rest of the world that, one, we have a lot of technology that can be used for good, and when there's a danger present, how do we address it holistically versus just attack versus attack in an escalating cyber arms race. So let me leave it with that. I know we have a little bit of time left, and I apologize for going beyond my half an hour here. But conversation across the board, thoughts? We have some cyber experts in the room who will probably tear me apart here, but or even just push back on the theory itself. And when you do speak, please stand up, introduce yourself, and let us know who you are and what your background's in. Now, we didn't get into the scary technical stuff, so I won't ask anybody to redo a router for it. Yeah, a friend from Ecuador, from Peru, excuse me.
Intelligence unit, like it's not my field of expertise, cybercrime, but I would like to know how actually you managed to have this joint effort with the private sector in order to prevent this kind of attacks. Because generally, many big companies do not want to release when they are attacked, because, come on, you know, they think that their reputation can be, you know, affected, and that customers will think, this company is not secure, I will not do any business with them. I cannot trust my credit card to this company. So, you know, there's a problem of communication, I guess, among the private sector and the government. So how do you manage to work together with the private sector in order to, you know, to protect yourselves against these kind of attacks?
Very good question. Yeah. No, exactly. So last year, I think the banking industry lost $38 billion. As a result of that, that makes an impact on their bottom line. But who do you do? When you're being DDoS, do you call NYPD? Do you call the FBI? Do you call up the White House? Well, in 2011, that's exactly what they did. They called the White House, and they said, hey, we have sensitive information out here. Nobody at JP Morgan or PNC or Wells Fargo wants to be the first to say, we've been breached, we've been hacked. Hacks happen all the time, breaches happen all the time, but this sophistication, this level of a nation-state sponsored threat, we're now looking at a situation where both the private sector and the US government have to say, what's in our national interest? If that had been a bomb that went off on Wall Street, would the United States have responded differently? If that had been a terrorist attack on Sony that cost them $1.35 billion sponsored by a state, would our response have been much more aggressive? So part of this challenge is the financial sector or any private sector wants to say, well, even if I tell you, what are you going to do about it? So far, the government has done very little in actually responding that they're aware of. So I think communication is a key aspect of this, and when we issued Presidential Executive Order 12636, it basically said, for critical infrastructure, you have a mandatory requirement to report to the government when this happens. So we removed the idea of, hey, this is optional. But for the private sector, we've really been looking at best practices. And let me give you an example. Absolutely, the financial sector being, I think, the most forward-leaning on this because they see the direct impact to their bottom line when these things happen. The financial sector's ISAC, or Information Sharing Analysis Center, based out of New York, is a group of 500 companies that basically came together. We would anonymize, or basically blank, what company it was coming from, but we would share the threat information. Because today, if you're being attacked by an Iranian cyber hacker out of Belgium, is where the router is coming from, it doesn't matter who they're attacking, it matters how they're attacking. So being able to share that good information in an unclassified, immediately usable way so that system engineers, security operators can go out there and look at ways to prevent it, just like what we saw with the banks. They actually were so confident in their material, they gave US Cyber Commands a heads up that they were going to be doing the attack down to the hour and to the day. And US Cyber Command, the banks were unable to stop it. The challenge here is that in addition to sharing information, we need to be sharing the solution. So when there is something that proves effective, just like if it was a real-world virus that was out, we as a country, as an entity, need to be able to share how do we best stop that threat. And sometimes the best threat is good defense. Sometimes the threat is what we call a honeypot. We create another server room where all that information is hit. Sometimes that means a attack back, or going after a server. And what that means is that even though it might be an entity in Iran who's orchestrating the attack, the actual threat is coming from your grandma's computer, or it's coming from a server in Poland, or it's coming from that new wireless refrigerator that you bought that you didn't even realize connected to the internet but is now part of the beaconing problem. So the challenge there is that we have to work with both our local law enforcement side, FBI, US Secret Service, as well as our international partner, State Department, before we go and take down a server in Poland that ends up bringing Poland's water grid offline. Ultimately, though, the relationship has to be instrumented by the private sector. If the federal government in whatever country attempts to legislate this, legislation will never keep up with the development of innovation. And so the technology will continue to move forward while the policy will continue to stay stagnant. At the White House, and even in this position, I've said time and time again, the technology will solve most solutions. The policy is what will be the limiting factor. And so as we continue to have executive orders that come out and hopefully a broad-based cybersecurity act that's already in the works in Congress come forward into law, hopefully a lot of those kinks will be worked out. And particularly I think for the private sectors to say, hey, there needs to be a level of liability protection here. If I tell you that I've been attacked, you can't then come back to me and say, well, now all these other sectors that you serve, if you're AT&T, have been impacted. You're now liable for everything that they lost in their intellectual property. We'll see all of our biggest ISPs, our internet service providers, go broke overnight. So there has to be a level of appreciation for what they can do, both legally and ethically. Very good question. Yes, sir.
James Sheets, I'm an attorney here in Des Moines. When we talk about Iran, we have to sometimes also talk about Israel.
Yeah.
Israel is both an ally and an unclear status partner in the sense that I think Kerry came out 6 months ago and said one of the biggest thefts of U.S. secrets was in fact Israel.
Yep.
And this is troubling it. Sometimes in Washington, this makes people uncomfortable with this sort of acknowledgement. And of course, Israel is Iran's most mortal enemy. So this issue here, where does Israel come in on this? And in talking to Iran, we're getting the Israeli Prime Minister in our Congress. And so I think there's a shifting of politics here in some way. Could you comment on this? Because we're looking at Iran as a primary bad actor. It is, of course, but there's nothing that's going on.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I would expand that, definitely Israel in this situation, but it expands beyond that to a number of allies that we have, including a number of European partners, a number of Asian partners who we have seen bleed off U.S. intellectual property, maybe not from the government, but from private entities. Part of this is the world of corporate espionage, and that is not specific to any one country. Any major corporation in the world does that. But specific to Israel, the relationship that we have there, we need to look at least from my perspective, in a way that says cyber is an instrument of power in the same way that we would say the economy is an instrument of power, or diplomacy is an instrument of power, or the military is an instrument of power. And in a lot of things we find that our national interests and the national interests of a country like Israel align far more often than the national interests we have against a country like Iran. And so while there are certainly parts of that relationship that don't benefit the United States, I think there are a lot more aspects of the relationship with Iran, or the current relationship between Washington and Tehran, that are detrimental to the United States' national interests. And I also offer are detrimental to the interests of the overwhelming majority of Iranian people. And so from that aspect, the idea that the United States either enters into operations or that the Israelis, as some have said, are frenemies, coming over here and working with us when it works for them and then going and doing their own sovereign actions on their own, definitely is a concern. The one side of it is that sometimes the best way to partner with an entity is to be able to share information, and that by cutting them off, does that then make them more dangerous in a country like Israel? Does it make the region less stable? And does it potentially open up a vector for another country to be able to do that? And so, as opposed to looking at just what the threat thresholds are between Israel and the United States, I would offer that the United States has the ability to lead on the policy side for international security by saying very clearly what its goals and intents are, what it believes to be appropriate action in cyberspace, and what it believes to be inappropriate action in cyberspace. And when it comes to those inappropriate actions, that we're establishing cyber norms around the world, whether that's North Korea, whether that's China, whether it's Iran, or whether it's Israel, there are certain things we don't tolerate. But we need to be clear on what those are. To be able to pick up the policy after the action's already been taken, unfortunately that's too late. It's very hard for the United States to go and say we won't do malicious attacks when there's a number of indicators that the United States has been involved in malicious attacks around the world. However, and I'll end on this, a number of those malicious attacks I think have achieved a far greater success in achieving U.S. national interests than anything in their peer group. All right, folks, yeah, absolutely.
Sorrel Brown, I'm a faculty at Iowa State University.
Yeah.
What's the message you want to leave us at this level?
Yeah, absolutely. So what should we be doing every day? And what am I doing in the state legislature to advance national security? I think one of the things is just being aware of it. I think far too many people think cyber is all ones and zeros, and the moment that anyone mentions it, they glaze over, up until the fact they realize how incredibly dependent they are on it. Obviously, good computer hygiene is a huge part of this, so making sure that you have antivirus on your computer, that you're aware of it. When there is something that's a threat to you, that you either take it to your Geek Squad at Best Buy or find somebody who's able to help you with this. But most importantly is to enter this into the general dialogue. It no longer needs to be the realm of international security experts and engineering technicians. This impacts all of us, and how we operate on it, where our national interests are something that we really need to engage and help, from the policy side at least, address what fits in that very narrow area of what the U.S. should and should not do, and what are we doing in a larger scale to be able to say, this is what America was founded on, these are our principles. Free speech, being able to coordinate effectively, not having additional taxation on the internet. Those are all things that all of us experience every day, every time you go on Amazon or post a blog or watch a YouTube video. Maintaining that as sacrosanct has been also some of the strongest drivers in helping change regimes in Egypt or change regimes in Estonia. So there's a lot of really great things that the internet provides. Being able to be smart when you're out there is a huge part of it.